Welcome back to Secrets of the Gospel. I believe this is week 9, and we are looking at the Gospel of John. Just a reminder and refresher for those of you that have been with us along this journey. This is an introduction, a close, what I'm calling overview, and at times a close reading, but by no means is it exhaustive. By no means is it meant to give you every little thing and every nugget throughout the Gospels. That's simply not possible. People spend their whole lives pining the depths for truth or for wisdom from these traditions. And so the purpose of this study is to give an overview, to help us with the three worlds of biblical criticism, to look behind the text, to look inside the text, and to look from our perspective, reading back to the text from our contemporary point of view with all that's going on in our worlds, the contemporary issues and things, injustices that we deal with. So we ask first, why is it and how is it that these stories continue to be relevant as we think about what it means, not just to follow in the way of Jesus, but to be able to have some type of competency for understanding how these texts can be read, interpreted, used, or and definitely misused to bring about things that are less than good, to say it lightly. So, my name is Dr. Shea Watts. I'm your host. Let's jump in to the Gospel of John, Part 1. Just a reminder that while John is a canonical gospel, it is not a synoptic gospel, meaning it can't be read closely with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that will become obvious as we delve in more so next week, but for this study, you'll start to realize some things are in a different order, and that by no means dismisses what the Gospel of John has to say to us or to show us, but I do think it changes how we can read and engage it. Like the other three Gospels, this Gospel is anonymous. We call it the Gospel according to John or ascribed to John, and this was later done. Nowhere in the text does it claim that authorship. In fact, there's this continual mysterious character of the disciple whom Jesus loved. The disciple whom Jesus loved, and we're to believe that perhaps is the author of the text, but it never comes out and says, "Psst, this is John." But later, communities attribute this to John, and also it's clear that this text is developed in two parts and in community, what we call the Johannine community, which may have actually been informed by the historical John. And so we have the Gospel of John, we have 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and all of this forms what we call the Johannine community. So a community greatly influenced by John, and could, as some scholars suggest, be written for or by those that were expelled from the synagogues. Why? Well, because they were confessing Jesus as Messiah, and Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity are forming at the same time, but they're using some of the same claims toward different ends. And so you could think about it and see quickly how controversy and conflict could come from the claims of Jesus as Messiah, likely written in Asia Minor. And like I said, some of it could have come from the beloved eyewitness, perhaps chapter 12 on, where we get into more of the stuff you see in the other Gospels. But like I said, it's not, no one is named, no one claims authorship. And I think what's important is this is a theological book. This is a theological work. It is not a history book. It is not meant to be, I don't want to say taken literally, but it's not meant to be read alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the same type of way. This book clearly has an agenda, and it's a high Christological book. So Christology is sort of the study or talk about the Messiah or the Christos, the Anointed One. And so it's very clear that the writers of John are showing us from the outset that Jesus is the Messiah, is the Son of God, is the Christ. We get 7 signs, not miracles. What are they signs of? That Jesus is who Jesus purports to be, claims to be. We don't get parables. We get mystagogic teachings, and we get really long discourses in between signs. And so Jesus is talking. There's a lot of talk about the connection between the Father and Jesus. And as I said earlier, 2 chunks. So the first 11 chapters and then 12 through 21. There are a couple interpolations to the text, that is, later added stories, and one of them is the woman caught in adultery. That's chapter 7, 53 through chapter 8, verses 13. And then chapter 21, the restoration, reconciliation of Jesus and Peter. Again, likely a later addition. And if you read John 20 and stop, you'll kind of feel the narrative is done, but yet we get this director's cut, if you will. John's purpose is clear. There's no there's no real nuance to it other than trying to understand some of the mystical sayings of Jesus or discourses. But chapter 20, 30 and 31, and again, this kind of bookends it for me and for a lot of scholars. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may, and there's some variation in the Greek of how you can interpret, come to believe or continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. We've talked about texts and how we don't have any of the original documents. So I want to flag and name for us that Papyrus P52, or St. John's Fragment, is one of the oldest that we have. It's only 3.5 by 2.5 inches, and it is at the John Rylands University Library in Manchester, England. And it contains parts, not whole things, but parts of 7 lines from the Gospel of John, chapter 18, 31 through 33 in Greek. And then on the back, you get 7 lines from verses 37 through 38. And remember, all capitals, no space or punctuation. So difficult. I want to talk a little bit about the worldview that influenced the world, obviously, worldview, but definitely the local world and the world in which and out of which the writers of John are writing. So if you look at this painting, this famous painting, you'll see lots of dudes, right? A couple women, but mostly dudes. People studying, hipsters of the time, if you will. Lots of skin being shown, particularly by this guy sitting on the stairs, maybe getting a little sun. Anyways, in the middle, though, we have 2 famous characters. The first is, want to guess? The person pointing up? Plato. So Plato is pointing up and holding his famous work or his books. And then beside Plato, we have Aristotle. And Aristotle isn't pointing up, but Aristotle's pointing out and also holding his book. And so Plato gets us a lot of understanding, or informs us of metaphysics. Hence why he's pointing up. The good is out there, beyond us. We can't reach it. And we are trapped in this sort of cave, right? If any of you have ever studied any Plato and you're trying to get out through reasoning and ascend the different forms so that we can hopefully get toward the good. Again, up there emanating toward us, doesn't come to us. We can try our best through reason, philosophy to get there. Aristotle says, no. We can live and make decisions called ethics and live a good life. And so we kind of have this vertical and horizontal axes. Think of it as like an XY. So one person talking about metaphysics and another person, that is Aristotle, talking about ethics and how we live our lives and how do we do good. So again, Plato's theory of forms, I don't want to spend too much time because, again, this is just an overview and meant to be an introduction, and certainly not, I'm not a classical philosopher in the sense that I studied Plato and Aristotle and all of this extensively, but as this graph, if you will, makes sense, the higher you get toward the good, the one, the beautiful, the truth, the light, all of that, you're getting closer to true being, you're getting closer to the good. And then if you look in the middle through reason, emotion, appetites, the world of 5 senses and time and space, you can either progress or ascend or digress or descend. And so shadows and paintings, complete darkness, that's the cave in which we all can be confined to if we don't seek to come out of it. So the next slide, don't judge me. This is my drawing, and this was really helpful, a way of thinking about this, and in particular, the worldview of John's writers and how they are subverting it, if not violating it. And so if you look here, cosmos, for God to love the world, the cosmos, okay, not just this planet, but the world, the creation, the universe, everything. Cosmos, it's all encompassing and inclusive. But there's this dome of death, deception, and darkness. Again, might sound like the cave, okay? And God is up there beyond that, or the good, or life, or light, or truth. And so Plato, Aristotle are trying to figure out how to get to the good. Is it through metaphysics? Is it through ethics? And interestingly, the writer of John, or writers, actually has the good, or God, the logos is the Greek word, coming to us, breaking through the veil of death, deception, and darkness into the cosmos in the form of the Word and in the flesh of the Son. And this was, or is, controversial to a Platonic worldview because the Logos can't become flesh. The whole point of the Logos is that it's reason or wisdom. It's an idea. It cannot be materialized, and yet the Gospel of John begins with, in the beginning was the Word. Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So it changes and disregards Plato's worldview and says, no, the good comes to us, breaks through the veil of death, deception, and darkness into our cosmos, into our internal struggle, in the form of the Word and in the flesh of the Son. So let's get into the prologue. First 18 verses, a lot of theology here. So in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That word, for word, hasa word yet, is logos, okay, reason. This idea of eternal wisdom, all of that, okay? So this is not a Christian word. This is not a word that John's using lightly, but logos is teeming with meaning. Word becomes sarx, which is, again, Gnosticism is secret knowledge, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. And it gets Plato, word becomes flesh. So it becomes the very thing that it is believed not to be or can be. The good, the light, truth breaks in. Logos fleshed out in Jesus, as I said. And David Bentley Hart has this to say about the prologue. There may perhaps be no passage in the New Testament more resistant to simple translation into another tongue than the first 18 verses, the prologue of the Gospel of John. The average reader would never guess that in the 4th century, those same verses were employed by all parties of the Trinitarian debates in support of very disparate positions. For one thing, the term logos really had, by the time the Gospel was written, acquired a metaphysical significance that word cannot possibly convey. Okay? So we're not privy to living among the first readers or hearers of the Gospel of John, but it would have a particular resonance that we just don't have a reference for here in the so-called West, in the so-called postmodern era, epic. So, moving out of the prologue, we meet this character that we meet in all of the Gospels, John the Baptist. Like other Gospels, John is preparing the way for the Lamb of God, as he says twice, who takes away the sins of the world. Okay, so theology and metaphor, okay? Theology and metaphor, think about that for the Gospel of John. And unlike other Gospels where John sends his people and says, hey, are you the one we look for? Or do we look for another person? Like, are you that dude or not? John the Baptist actually testifies that Jesus is Son of God in John. Why is that important? Because that's the whole point of the book. And then Jesus begins calling his disciples, and there's this ongoing invitation to come and see, which I think is really kind of interesting, like come and see, but also like come and see. And then we get the first sign. Jesus goes to a party. On the 3rd day, there was a marriage at Cana. Mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited with his disciples. When the wine gave out, it's a bad party foul. Mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Jesus said to her, woman, what do you have to do with me? In other words, what am I supposed to do about it? Like, my hour's not yet come. His mother ignores him and says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now 6 stone jars were standing there for the Jewish rites of purification. Stop there. 6 stone jars standing there for the Jewish rites of purification. Okay? This Jesus that's always getting in trouble with religious rituals, but challenging the heart of them in hopes to transform not just what is done, but out of the abundance of the heart, of purifying the heart, not so much the outside, but the inside. Okay, so these 6 stone jars for Jewish rites of purification for bathing water, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus says, fill them with water. They fill them to the brim. Jesus says, draw some out, take it to the steward of the feast, to the wedding party or wedding party planner or whoever's there taking pictures, maybe coordinating with the DJ. And so they do it. And then the steward of the feast tastes the water, now become wine. That's an important detail, not just funky bath water. Did not know where it came from. The steward called the bridegroom and said, hey, everyone serves the good wine first, and then when everyone's drunk and can't taste anything anymore, then they give the poor wine, the $2 chuck. But you've kept the good wine until now. And then John says, this is the first of his signs. Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, manifested his glory. His disciples believed in him. So Jesus is taking a Jewish purification rite container and doing his first sign in it and showing what is offered is better than that which was previously offered. Okay, so all types of theological meaning and literal meaning, really, about what Jesus is doing. It's a little bit on the nose almost. Then in John's gospel, we get, after Jesus' first sign, immediately we get the cleansing of the temple. So this is in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And in this 12 or 13 verses here, we get the Jews 3 times. And I've talked about it before, but the Gospel of John has been historically weaponized against Jewish folks. And I want to say that again, with all the anti-Semitism floating around in our culture and in the world, from Nick Fuentes to Kanye West to former presidents who won't condemn certain ideas because they fear they may alienate their base. Anyways, the Jews, we need to be really careful. Martin Luther used treatise against the Jews and their lies and quoted from John to do that. And a guy named Adolf Hitler picked that book up and sort of used it as his theological grounds for genociding, killing Jews in the Holocaust. So, and here we can kind of see that Jesus' body takes on a metaphorical temple identity, not unlike some of the other Gospels. Chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night. So he's a Pharisee, part of the Sanhedrin. That he comes to Jesus at night should pique our interest, perk our ears up to say, maybe he doesn't want to be seen. But he recognizes Jesus is a teacher from God and names the signs as proof. And Jesus says, hey man, you got to be born again or born anew, which is to say perhaps born of water, born of spirit. So we're already born of water in a way, but born of water could also mean baptism, which would have been the common practice of conversion by this time for sure. And spirit, maybe the gift of the Holy Spirit. We'll talk about that in chapter 20. And then Jesus says the wind or the spirit or the breath, all interchangeable meanings of this word pneuma, blows where it wills. So we can feel it. We can't always see it until it's kind of too late and the wind's blowing. We see the trees by virtue of the wind already affecting them. Verses 16 through 21, it's difficult to know who's speaking. Again, John 3:16, we all know it. It's like it literally is the bumper sticker of Christianity, but I don't think it should be. Not just because it's grossly misinterpreted and isolated, but in doing the gross interpretation and isolation of the text, we forget that Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. So if this was Jesus' core teaching, telling one person in the dark is probably not the best way to spread it. And Jesus says, hey, the light comes into the world and exposes the darkness. Again, darkness, there at night, Nicodemus, etc. And then we get a bit about baptism in the rest of chapter 3. Jesus and his disciples go into the countryside in Judea, and the disciples are actually baptizing people And we learn that Jesus and John the Baptist, their ministries actually overlap, their ministries of baptism. Again, think about baptism versus the Jewish purification ritual, the first sign, all of that. So there's a bit of that going on theologically. And then we learn that Jesus has the power from God to grant the Spirit to people, which he'll do in chapter 20. Spoiler alert. Then we meet the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, not named. The disciples, not Jesus, get a reputation for baptizing more people than John. So they're kind of they're leading in the polls, if you will, for the Messiah. And this encounter is really set up by the cultural norm that Jews and Samaritans wouldn't eat together, really wouldn't talk to each other. Then there's the whole gender dynamic. But Jesus engages her. They meet at noon in broad daylight, as opposed to Nicodemus, who meets with Jesus at night. So this woman is out in the open, quite literally laid bare with her encounter with Jesus. And, living water, Jesus asks for a drink. She says, why would you ask me? Jesus says, if you knew who I was. And then basically says, I'll give you living water. Again, living water parallels to Nicodemus. It also could speak about the waters of baptism, or it could just be this idea of life and being born again. Interestingly, Jesus says, hey, I see you, basically. And it's couched in the language of multiple marriages, in this idea that the one she's with isn't her husband and all this, but she has this moment in which she believes Jesus and becomes a messenger for Jesus, and many Samaritans believe because of her. Why is that important? Well, as we know from other Gospels, Jesus' ministry wasn't always, if ever, successful in Samaria. Then we get a second sign. So there's some discourse. Now here we have a sign. Same place to where Jesus made water into wine. He's coming back. And this time he meets an official whose son is ill, dying on his deathbed. And Jesus says, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And which echoed in other Gospels. And the official says, sir, come down before my child dies. And Jesus just says to him, go, your son will live. And it says the man believed that the word Jesus spoke to him and went his way. And as he was going down, he learned that his son made a recovery. And when he asked when, he realized it was the same time that he was speaking with Jesus. Then we get another sign in chapter 5, healing of the lame man. And Jesus, he's there by the pool. He's on his mat. And Jesus asked the man, do you want to be made well? And then, why not? Been waiting all this time, Jesus. Thanks for the question. And then Jesus says, take up your mat and walk. Well, taking up your mat would violate the Sabbath. So again, the Jews are watching the Jews. And now they begin persecuting Jesus, or at least he's on their radar. Verse 24 echoes or harkens back to John 3:16 and this idea that the world, there's a realized eschatology. There's an end of the age. There's a new chapter that's happening. And John wants us to know that all of this is going on in the midst of Jesus' ministry, not after it. A lot of father talk. I am the Father, Abba, which really transcends the idea of gender, but that's for another study, perhaps. And then as Jesus is being questioned, Jesus accuses his Jewish opponents of misunderstanding their own scriptures, as a result alienating God. Jesus essentially turns their accusations around on them. Then we get a fourth sign. I saw the sign. It opened up my eyes. I saw the sign. Sorry I had to do it, because by this time you're probably getting bored, I would imagine. So Jesus feeds the multitude, and there are 12 baskets of leftovers. Should sound familiar to you. It's in the other Gospels. This is a fourth sign. And then we get a bread of life discourse, where Jesus is talking about how his body, or the body, can be extended. We say Eucharist, meaning good gift, which we celebrate in the ritual of communion, which is the body, and the blood, which is the bread and the wine or grape juice, depending on what tradition you come from. And then Jesus in verse 54 says, they that eat my flesh and drink my blood are my people. So that's a Jewish law violation. Why? Because you don't drink blood, and you don't, and you certainly don't eat things that eat other living things. And so it makes sense to us then that Jesus would be, and Christians early on were accused of being cannibals. Then we get the interpolation, the adulterous woman. And really the only question we need to ask, one of the main questions we need to ask is, where's the man? Takes two to tango. If she was caught in the act, did the man just disappear? Did he, once he was caught, sort of blame the woman and scapegoat her? But Jesus sees what's going on. And as they're getting ready, like, hey, she deserves to be stoned, Jesus writes something in the sand, and there are lots of books and great sermons about what he's writing. But the real question is, where's the man? And I think that's important to think about. Why too, would this story be added later on? Then we get a confrontation with the Jews, and we learn that quite simply, discipleship or being Jesus' disciple means believing in Jesus' message, because you're believing in God who sent Jesus, and you're made free. No recognition of being bound or bondage to anything. And interestingly here, the Jews that the text is speaking of claim a covenantal relationship with one God, and they accuse Jesus of violating monotheism by asserting his sonship. Jesus denies their covenantal relationship on the grounds that they reject God's son. So you kind of have one side of the argument, which I think is valid, of, hey, if you're also God, that's not monotheism. How does that work? And again, Trinity takes hundreds of years, and no one can really understand it still. And Jesus says, no. You deny this covenant relationship because you don't recognize God made flesh to you. And then Jesus says, before Abraham was, I was, or I am. And so that's blasphemy. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but he left and went out of the temple. Fifth sign is the healing of a blind man. And again, sin and illness in the ancient world were linked. Whose sin was it that this man was born blind? Whose fault is it? How can we blame this? Jesus spits in the mud, rubs it in the man's eyes. Man goes away and is healed. But the Jews want the man to thank God, not Jesus, who they call a sinner. Again, can't be God. This is God. What is happening? And then when he says, hey, I don't know who's a sinner and who's not, but I know I can see. And so they respond to the now seeing man. You were born entirely in sins, and you were trying to teach us. And Jesus says, hey, I came that those that cannot may see, and those who do see may become blind. He's talking about you, Pharisees. I don't want to say the Jews. And then we learn Jesus is the gate for the sheep. Whoever enters by me will be saved, and that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. There's one flock, one shepherd. Monotheism, okay? You do not believe me because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep know my voice. It's familiar. They're listening. They can see. And Jesus does God's works, which are proof. The signs are proof of his identity. Again, core principle in John. And once again, the Jews wanted to stone him, then try to arrest him. But Jesus slips through their fingers. And that gets us to the end of chapter 10. And for our next lesson, we'll look chapter 11 and then segue to part 2, which is chapter 12 through 21. And we'll finish our time with the Gospels and move to Gnosticism, canonization, and its history, and then end with how do we read, interpret, use theory when it comes to reading strategies and hermeneutics. That is the way of interpreting texts and life. So take good care. Happy holidays, everybody. Happy Advent, and I'll see you soon.